Hello, I'm Pam Farrow, and I'm a storyteller. Welcome to this digital workshop on making any story your own. Storytelling is an art form. It's different from story writing or from making a play. It's an art form where someone tells a story and someone watches and listens, and everyone's imagination is engaged in creating the story experience. Now, it is an art form that some professionals devote themselves to, and it's also a deeply human, ancient, very natural way to communicate and to entertain that is accessible and doable for practically everyone. So today, we're going to look at a basic storytelling skill. That is how to create your own version of any story. This process that we're going to be in, called making a story your own, is great because you don't want to just copy the way somebody else is telling a story or just read a story and memorize it and recite it. Now, this is a process you can take any story and find a way to use your imagination to create your own version, and we call that making it your own. I'm going to start by telling you my version of a story that's been around for a long time, and maybe you already know this story. Well, here's the way I tell it. North Wind did not like sun at all. In fact, North Wind loved the coming of winter because as winter approached, Sun, that old spoil sport, would be showing his yellow face in North Wind's neighborhood for shorter and shorter amounts of time, and he'd be traveling further and further off to the south. And this would leave North Wind with many hours of darkness to do whatever he pleased. He would sweep and blow across the open plains. He'd scream over mountain passes and whip and roar through spruce and pine forests. Any time he came to a town or a village, he would bluster and bustle through from the widest of plazas to the narrowest of alleys. Any loose roof tiles or cobblestones were toys for North Wind. If anyone had left laundry hanging out to dry on the line, well, it was a plaything for North Wind to do with as he pleased. He almost welcomed Sun's brief appearances each day, because then everyone could see by Sun's clear light just what North Wind had done during the night. Well, one day, North Wind was feeling particularly smug. Yeah, he was feeling real full of himself, because you see, that day, well, Sun had barely shown up at all. And when he did, well, he was further off to the south than North Wind could remember having seen him for a long time. So North Wind called out to Sun like this. "Hey, what's the matter with you? How come you don't stick around here in the north anyway, huh? Well, you're scared I'll blow you out of the sky. You're just yellow." Yellow, Sun. You coward. You milksop. You poltroon. I don't know, you might want to look that one up in a dictionary. Yeah, you think you're so great, just galloping across the sky. You think you're such hot stuff. Hot stuff. What do you say? Let's have ourselves a contest, huh? Let's see which one of us has the most power. Anyway, Well, if North Wind had been looking at Sun just then, instead of looking down on earth for his next conquest, well, he might have seen Sun flare a bit more brightly for a moment. But he only heard Sun's answer, which was, "And what have you in mind for such a contest, brother?" Aha, aha, I see. You see that horseman down there? Oh, oh, maybe you can't see him 'cause you're too far to the south, brother. But Sun answered, "Oh, do you mean the man on the horse wearing the long red cloak on his shoulders?" "Yeah, that's the one." "Well, he looks too pleased with that cloak to suit me. Let's see which one of us can make that cloak come off of his shoulders in the shortest amount of time, shall we? Let that be our test of power." And Sun answered, "Agreed. You may take the first turn, brother, while I stay here in the south a while longer." So, since it was North Wind's turn, he was going to go first. North Wind began to move and to blow stronger and stronger, and pretty soon people were chasing their hats down the street in the wind, and they were holding very tightly onto the hands of small children so they wouldn't be blown down the street in the wind. Any leaves that were still left on the trees were soon swirling through the air in fantastic designs. All of the animals began looking for shelter from the growing wind. The dogs crawled under porches and went behind barn walls. All of the cows, they began to moo and to bump nervously against each other. All of the people went into their homes, and they shut their doors and windows tightly against the growing force of the wind. Why, even out in the harbor where all the ships were anchored, the waves were whipped to such a height that many of the ships were overturned and sank. But the harder North Wind blew, the more tightly that horseman held his red cloak onto his shoulders. After a time, North Wind was spent, and it was Sun's turn. Sun, of course, was still in the south, but as it was his turn, Sun began to move, and he came closer and closer to North Wind's neighborhood. And as he came, he sent his warm and gentle rays down to the earth below. And as they touched, wonderful things began to happen. Small green plants began pushing themselves up out of the warming earth. Flowers of every color and description appeared everywhere. Insects came out and hummed and buzzed and moved all about. All the animals came out of their hiding places and either played or took a nap in the sun, whichever they wanted. The people, they threw open their doors and windows and they stepped out into the sunshine, and they talked and they laughed and they worked and they played. And the horseman, of course, you remember the horseman. Well, in all of that warm, warm sunshine, that horseman grew hot. And he stopped his horse by a riverbank. He got down off of his horse. He reached up with one hand and he removed his cloak from his shoulders. And then he took off the rest of his clothes and dove in for a swim. So you see, what North Wind, with all of his power and strength, could not accomplish, Sun achieved with gentleness and warmth. And that's how I tell Aesop's fable of the contest between the wind and the sun. Now that's maybe a story that you already know. But if you've not heard me before, I doubt that you would have heard it told quite like that before. Or if you've read it, it didn't have all that same language and description in it. With this workshop, you have an additional document called the stories document. It looks like this, has some stories on it with boxes. If you're able to have it printed, that would be great, or you can just read it off of your device as well, either after you pause the video, or maybe if you have a way to do it side by side. But on the top of the stories page is another version of the same story that I just told you. It's a written version by another storyteller by the name of Heather Forrest. And this written version is something that you can read on your own. And when you do, you will see that the words she chose are different. Now, when you're reading it, you won't be able to see some of the physical things you saw me do. You saw me use gesture. You heard me use my voice. And you won't do that if you read the story. But when you read the story, you'll see that she made different choices about the details. And yet, you'll be able to recognize that it's the same story as the one that I just told you. So what happened was, both she and I know what we call the bones of the story. Yeah, that's the language we use to find the bare bones of a story. You know, in our bodies, we have bones, we have a skeleton that gives us our structure, but we're all different. In addition to bones, there's muscle and skin and hair and clothes and maybe jewelry or tattoos. We're all different. But the bones is what give us our structure, So a story has what we call the bare bones. And that, one way to think of it, is maybe the fewest number of sentences that you could use to tell what happens in a story. Not just words. You wouldn't say wind, sun, contest, cloak, So it's like the fewest number of sentences to tell the story as bare as possible. Just the bones. And in your study guide, you will see that there's a version of the bare bones of this story of the wind and the sun. So in just a minute, I'll be asking you to pause this video and go spend a little bit of time with the study guide. So if you have the study guide, again, either printed or on your device, and the stories document where you can read Heather Forrest's version of this same story, in the study guide you'll see an example of how the bones of the wind and the sun story might be. And then below that, you'll see some examples of some of the choices I made in telling the story. And then the study guide will ask you to take an action. So you might have your pen or pencil and a piece of paper ready, or you could just do it with your imagination and your voice. But sometimes both writing and using your voice is the best way. And the action is to think about some of the choices you heard and saw me make. You might even compare it with a written version found on the story sheet. But what are the choices, the kinds of choices you saw and heard me make to dress up, flesh out the bones of the story? So, after you take that action, you read the examples of the bones of this story of the wind and the sun, consider some of the examples of how I made choices, writing and speaking aloud maybe, some of those choices, give that some thought. And then when we come back together, we'll explore the next steps. So take that action, and I'll see you back here after a few minutes. Welcome back. So you just had a chance to spend some time with seeing how the bones of the wind and the sun story could be understood. And then some of the ways that I chose to dress it up and had you remember and think about that. Maybe you thought of some of the dialogue that I spoke, or some of the ways I did the voice or the motions for the different characters, or some of the details I put in about how the wind and the sun affected the people and the animals and the objects in the story. You wouldn't find that in the bones, but it's how I made it my version, made it my own. Well, now you will have a chance to give this process a try for yourself with a story. On the stories document that I talked about in the first section, again, whether you have it printed like this or maybe on your device, you will find 3 traditional stories. They're folk tales and fables. They're each quite short, but they're fleshed out. They're not just bare bones. So the action that the study guide invites you to take is to choose one of those stories, any one, it doesn't matter, and then take pen or pencil and paper and identify and write down the bare bones of the story that you chose. See how you can tell what happens in the story in the fewest possible sentences. Now remember, don't just use separate words. Like if you chose the first story about a flock of birds, you wouldn't just say birds, hunter, net. Well, say some sentences, tell what happens, but in the fewest possible sentences. So that's your first action to do next. And then after that, the next action is for you, probably with pen and paper, but out loud is good too, is to imagine some of the creative details you might add to flesh out and dress up the bare bones of the story that you reduced it to. Because what you're doing is a process to form your own version of the story, not just sort of memorizing what's printed on the page, right? So I'm going to get my notes here and make sure I don't miss something. So for example, whichever story you choose, it's going to have one or more characters in it. So choose a character. Just do it for one character at a time. Choose a character and think about, what is that character like physically? Is that character big or small, old or young, is heavy, is thin, maybe quick or slow? These are thoughts you can make and choices that you can make about your character. You can actually do this with each of the characters separately, but just do one at a time. Think about, how does that character move? Quickly or slowly, smoothly or jerkily, heavily, these kinds of things. So imagine that for yourself. Also, choose a part of the story, because a lot of things happen in a story, so just choose a part of the story and think about the character. And then think about, at that point in the story, what is the character feeling? What emotion is that character experiencing? At that moment, is that character happy or sad or frightened or angry or surprised or suspicious? You need to imagine that for yourself, and you can do that for that character at different points in the story, and then you can do it with different characters in the story. This is a way to really imagine your own details, to find your own version of the story. Does the character have a voice? How does it sound? Is it a deep voice? Is it a high voice? Is it a squeaky voice? Is it a slow voice? Different ways a character might speak. Think about that. And so then, what words might the character say? Now again, you got away from whatever the printed version is. There's some dialogue, I think, in all three of the stories that are printed on the story sheet. But you got it down to your bare bones, and after you've done that, you think of what you would like this character to say, or that character to say, and how the character would say it. So those are some questions you can ask yourself and details you can imagine and create for your characters. But what about the setting, the place where the story happens? Now, all stories happen somewhere, and some stories have more than one place. So whatever story you choose, it might just have one place, or it might have a couple of different locations. But whatever the setting is, think about that. Can you imagine what is in that place around the characters? What might the characters see? And you might mention that in the story, or you might not. It just might be part of your own imagination, but it might be something you would put in the story. That's your choice. What might be in the setting that you could hear, or smell, or feel? These are questions you can ask yourself and details you can imagine to start fleshing out and dressing up the bones of your story. So whichever one of those 3 stories you choose, go through this process, these 2 actions listed on your study guide, and it will be a way to create your own version. Then comes the best part. Whether you write it down or not, speaking these, because storytelling is telling stories. And so I encourage you to find someone to speak to try out your ideas with, or to try out the version you're in the process of creating with. Maybe a family member in your home, maybe a friend online, maybe even to yourself in a mirror. That can be helpful. I know some people who have even practiced their stories with a stuffed animal or a pet. So any of those things, it's good for you to use your voice in practicing some of these choices that you're making. We are, after all, talking about storytelling. So after you have a chance to practice some of that, then you'll come back here for the 3rd and final segment of the video, and we'll talk some more about what you've done and what you might do with it in the future going forward. So go have some fun. Choose a story, do the action of writing down its bones, and then the action of spending time with creating details to flesh out and dress up those bones. I'll see you back here in a bit. Welcome back. So how did that process go for you? I hope you had some fun, or at least found it interesting to reduce a story to its bare bones, and then playing with, imagining, creating different ways of fleshing it out and dressing it up to create your own version. You might have already come up with a whole version ready to tell, or you might be somewhere in the process, figuring out bits here and bits there. It's all a continually growing and experimenting and almost a playing kind of process. So thank you for doing that with me. This is a process you can do with any story. You can, if you haven't already, do it with the other 2 stories or one of them on the story sheet. Or you can do it with any story you find anywhere. Now, the study guide has some suggestions of where you might go to find other stories to work with. It might be a book in your home, or you might get one from a library. It might be a story you heard sometime, or family stories, something that happened to you or you heard from another family member. You can always do this process with any story to create your own version and make it your own. Now, at the bottom of the stories document, you might have seen in the box the bare bones of another story. And if you didn't pay attention to it or read it yet, that's fine. You could pause and read it now, or you can just read it later. But it's there to go with the next and final story I'm going to share with you. It's a short story. It's a story that, I'm going to give you a heads up. You're going to hear some Spanish in this story. And that's an example of something else you can do. If you have a particular ability or skill, like you know a bit of another language, like I know some Spanish, you don't have to. It's something I happen to know and be able to do. Or maybe you have a musical ability. You can sing or you can play an instrument. Something that you can do, that's something you can sometimes bring into a story as you're creating your own version to it. So here, you'll hear some Spanish in my version of this little story. Once, there was a mouse. She was a mother mouse. She had 4 ratoncitos. Yeah, 4 little baby mice. And they all lived together in a little hole out in el campo, out in the countryside of northern New Mexico. And one day, it was a beautiful day. The sun was shining and the breeze was blowing. Los 4 ratoncitos turned to their mother and they said, Mama, vamos a dar un paseo. Let's go for a walk. And la mamá said, Bueno, vamos. Well, that's a good idea. Let's go. So with la mamá in front, y los 4 ratoncitos atrás, right behind her, they left their little hole and they went out through their field, taking a walk along their path, and it was a beautiful day. El sol was shining warm on their fur. El viento was blowing the grasses and the flowers. And just as that little mouse family came around a curve in their path, they saw it. Rear. Rear. El gato, cried la mamá. The cat. Corren, corren. Run away, my children. Los cuatro ratoncitos ran and hid. La mamá turned around. She faced el gato. She took a deep breath, and that little mouse mother said to that big cat, "Ruff, ruff. Y el gato turned around and ran away. La mamá called to her children, "Ven, ven, come, my children." Y los cuatro ratoncitos all sat down and looked up at their mamá. She looked down at them and she said, "Pueden ver. You can see, my children. It is a good idea to know something of another language." She knew mouse language, of course. What other animal language did she know? Dog. And it came in handy. So I don't need to bring another human language, Spanish, into it, but because I can, it felt appropriate to bring that into my version of telling this story. And now I want to congratulate you on learning some storyteller language that you may or may not have known before. That we work with the bones of a story, that we find ways to flesh it out and dress it up. And these are ways that you can make a story your own. I hope you have fun doing this going forward, and maybe someday I'll get to hear a story of yours. That would be wonderful. Thank you for spending the time here, and enjoy storytelling.